Hi folks, welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. We are going to wait a few minutes for everyone to join. As you're just entering, feel free to fill out the poll that you'll see on your screen. I'd also invite you, if you'd like to say hello over in the chat and just share where you're joining us from tonight. All right, we've got lots of folks hopping in. If you're just joining us, welcome to the presentation tonight. You should see a poll right in the middle of your screen. Feel free to fill that out while we're just gathering here. Also over in the chat, if you'd like to say hello, feel free to introduce yourself and just share where you're joining us from tonight. Looks like we've got folks from here in Grand Marais, from Minneapolis, Northfield, a few from Wisconsin, Lindstrom, lots of different locales joining in tonight. If you've just hopped on, feel free to fill out the poll that's in the middle of your screen. We're going to wait a few more minutes while people are joining us. Welcome, folks. If you're just hopping on, feel free to fill out the poll that's in the middle of the screen. Folks are also just saying hello, introducing themselves in the chat and sharing where they're joining us from tonight. Looks like the furthest away participant so far is here from San Antonio, Texas. And we've got lots of folks here from Grand Marais, right where North House is located. We'll wait just another minute here as people are joining. All right. Well, it's a few minutes after 7, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here tonight. We're so grateful to have you as part of the Wooden Boat Show online edition this week. My name is Sarah, and I'm a program manager here at North House Folk School. And I have the honor tonight of getting to tell you a little bit about how Zoom works before we turn things over to our featured presenter, who I know we're all so excited to hear from tonight. If you've never been on a Zoom webinar like this before, there's a few things you should know. You can see us, but we can't see you. So there's no way for you to have your video on during this. You don't need to worry about that. It also means that we can't hear you. So if you have something that you're wanting to communicate with us, there are a few different ways that you can do that. Along the bottom of your webinar screen, you should see a few different icons that pop up. You might have to move your mouse down there if you don't see them. If you're on a phone, it might be on the side of the screen. You might have to tap the screen to see them as well. One of those things is the chat. If you don't have the chat open yet, that's a great thing to have open during the webinar. You can use the chat to send a message to the panelists, or you can send a message to everyone that everyone on the webinar will be able to see. And you can use that if you're having trouble seeing or hearing something, need some help, or just have a comment you'd like to share. The other feature that's helpful is the Q&A. You'll find that in the same area where you found the chat. If you open up the Q&A, that's what you'll use to submit questions. We'll collect the questions there, and at the end, we'll save time for Staci to answer questions from everyone. Please do use the Q&A to ask questions instead of the chat, because as the chat gets added and added onto, questions can get kind of buried in there. So go ahead and put questions in the Q&A if you have them tonight. All right, I think those were the main things to share about how to use. There's also the poll here that's up right now. If you haven't had a chance to fill that out, go ahead and fill that out and we'll get that off the screen pretty soon when we start. And the other thing I was going to mention is if for any reason there's a weird glitch and we lose connection or the internet goes funky, never fear. We will be recording the session tonight and we'll be emailing out a link to everyone tomorrow with information about how to view the recording if you'd like to watch it again or if something funny happens with your internet. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to our program director, Jessa, who will be telling you a bit more about the boat show and introducing the speaker.
Hi, thanks, Sarah. Good evening, everybody. My name's Jessa Frost, and I'm the program director here at Northhouse Folk School, and it is a real pleasure to welcome you to this third speaker in our Wooden Boat Show speaker series. The Wooden Boat Show is an event that Northhouse has been hosting pretty much since the school started in 1997 as an excuse to gather on the harbor and celebrate the summer solstice and the community of makers here in Cook County and wooden boats and the arrival of summer. And I will confess, this is the 11th boat show that I've been a part of, but I usually spend a lot of time worrying about the weather this weekend because this event is so much more fun when it's beautiful out. And one great thing about having an online wooden boat show is that I am much less concerned about the forecast than I would normally be. So I am so glad that you guys are all willing to join us in front of screens on this lovely June evening. And I'm really grateful to welcome our speaker tonight. Staci Drouillard works here in her home community of Grand Marais. She is a Grand Portage tribal descendant and has been working on a book project for a couple of decades now, interviewing elders in her community, starting in 1987. And the culmination of that work was in December of 2019 when she published her book, Walking the Old Road. And that is what she's going to read from tonight. It's a wonderful book, highly recommended, available in the Northhouse School Store and in Drury Lane Books and a whole bunch of other wonderful local bookstores. But it's been recognized by her peers as well as a wonderful contribution to helping us all understand the story of this place where we are living. We here at Northhouse, every time we gather here on campus, we are gathering on Anishinaabe land and understanding our connection to the history and the culture of the people who have been here for long before many of us showed up is a really important part of developing a rooted craft practice. I think in light of recent events, this has certainly been on my mind about the role Northhouse can play and our obligation to be a partner to our Grand Portage neighbors. And hopefully part of that is helping people connect who love Northhouse and come here because they love Northhouse, also connect with the stories of the people who are from here. And so I am really grateful to Staci tonight for joining us. Her book has recently been awarded the Hamlin Garland Prize in Popular History from the Midwest History Association, and it was nominated for the Minnesota Book Award. So congratulations to Staci for that. And I think with that, I can go ahead and turn over the rest of this evening's presentation to Staci. Thanks for being here, and I look forward to answering your questions with Staci when we wrap up.
Thanks, Jessa. Congratulations to Northhouse for making sure the show goes on, and thanks for inviting me here tonight. The topic for the evening, as Jessa mentioned, was generated from the work done in Walking the Old Road, A People's History of Chippewa City and the Grand Marais Anishinaabe. It comes from chapter 7 of the book, which is titled Indian Maidens and Plastic Tomahawks, How to Make a Living. And the purpose for tonight's talk, and I will be sharing some readings from the book as well as some other snippets, as well as a whole bunch of amazing photos. But the reason I chose this topic tonight is to honor the makers and the artists and the Anishinaabe crafts women and men who really paved the way for our modern creative economy. We're a place that honors creative work, including books and artwork and the teaching of traditional crafts. And so tonight's topic will touch on that. I want to point out that this first picture is Philomene Evans, a woman who lived in Mineral Center and ran her own souvenir stand back in the 1930s and 40s. She made handmade items to sell to tourists. And so we really want to honor people like Philomene and the work that was done to make way for the amazing work that continues on here in Cook County. And there we go, my controls have disappeared, and there they are again. Everyone say this to yourselves at home. Be Madizi, Adizu Khan. That's referring to the living story of the Anishinaabe people. And my cousin Bob Swanson, who is an artisan himself, he does amazing quill work and beadwork, shared this with me. In the Anishinaabe tradition, a story or legend is considered both animate and inanimate. It is a single item, but it is also something that lives, and in living not only remains, but changes. The story changes as people bring forth old remnants and put them in place to create a new story. That story, Bima Dizi Adazu Khan, lives and continues to grow, and it's up to the people like us to determine that it's remembered and honored. This next photo is actually, many of you will recognize, it's taken on the Point or Artist Point, where the museum is, the Cook County Historical Society Museum. And this is a powwow taking place one summer in Grand Marais. Grand Marais and Chippewa City are Anishinaabe lands. And before I start any historical talk, I want to try to clear up some misconceptions that a lot of people have about who the people are. Chippewa, Ojibwe, 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 Anishinaabe. Those are all names for the same group of people, the Lake Superior Anishinaabe. And the words in some cases are mispronunciations of others. In some cases, like Chippewa is actually a nonsense word. And the people traditionally are Anishinaabe, which means the first people or the spontaneous people. The word for this place, Grand Marais, everyone say this together from your homes, Kitchi Bitubig. Kitchi Bitubig is the Anishinaabe name for what is now known as Grand Marais. And Kitchi Bitubig, any idea what that might mean? It's referring to a double bay or two bodies of water. Here are some Anishinaabe people from Cook County, the Lake Superior region, Grand Marais. On the left is a man named Cognishwe, lived in Grand Marais, also known as Longbody. The center photo is a mother and baby with a handmade tikanagan, and that was taken in downtown Grand Marais right around the turn of the century, about 1898 is the date of that photo. And on the right is a posed photograph of the very famous John Bear Grease, namesake of the John Bear Grease sled dog marathon. And so these are just a few of the Anishinaabe faces from Nishkwa Kwansing, which is Chippewa City, also known as the edge of the forest. And I'm going to go to Walking the Old Road now and share a story that I think a lot of people will relate to. It was written by Jim Anderson, and he's talking about when he was working as a logger as a teenager, where he learned an important lesson from a man named Charlie Drouillard, who was my great uncle. And this is what Jim wrote. Some old timers here will remember Victor Johnson and Charlie Drouillard, for that's who they were, sure enough. One buggy evening after an easy day in the swamp with saw, ace, and bugs, Charlie D came over to our tent to see if we had starved out and bunched it. I think he was sorry to see us ragged, dirty, and hungry all the time. Though we jumped in the lake every day, we never thought to wash clothes all summer. Now, Vic and Charlie were used to roughing it, I said, any time of the year. And we could see, and they could see we weren't doing so hot. Come on over to my teepee, says old quiet Indian Charlie. I got something for you boys. There he gave us freshly made donuts, hot, sweet, all we could eat, cooked fine brown in a black kettle of smoking hot bear grease. Never before or since have I eaten anything to compare to that tasty treat. Even after that, we thought Charlie Drouillard was a good man to know. He may have seemed inclusive to some people, but I know he could also be good, for he was real kind to brother and me, and he shared what little he had with us up there. Oh, I am missing some pages. Oh, there we go. And he shared what little he had with us a long time ago that day in the pulp swamp. 2 teenage boys and 1 old Indian were brothers. We're all brothers, you know. On the North Shore, there's no great equalizer like a batch of fresh donuts. In order to make a living, everyone had to work hard and work together. It is because of the hard work and fortitude of the people who came before us that the North Shore is the culturally rich place that it is today. It's probably not a secret that Anishinaabe people are the people who taught others to build and make birch bark canoes. The Anishinaabe people are water people. They traveled by water from far in the east to the North Shore on Lake Superior and all waterways inland. And this picture is actually taken in Grand Marais of canoe builders here on the North Shore. Canoe builders traditionally are very honored and highly respected. And the ability to travel on water has always been key to survival for the people. And if you want to know more details about the nitty-gritty of canoe building, a great reference is Chippewa Customs by Frances Densmore. And she goes into detail at great length about traditional canoe making and how it was done, even specifics like measurements and when the bark was taken and things like that. It's a very interesting resource for boat builders. Speaking of boat builders, this is a lapstrake boat being built right on the harbor, right on the Grand Marais Harbor. And I believe the man in the hat is Paul Cadence. At least this man looks very similar to other pictures of Paul Cadence that I've seen. And if you look at the shoreline, you can see very clearly a very different version of Grand Marais. The Anishinaabe people relied on old ways as new ways were introduced, including fishing, and we all benefit from that tradition today as I watch lines of people across the street waiting for herring and chips. And here are a couple of the Anishinaabe people from Chippewa City. On the left is Bill or William Drouillard, who was a commercial fisherman out of Chippewa City. And on the right is Catherine Boyer Scott. And the Scotts lived where the Crawfield Road is now, which was originally an allotment as part of the Treaty of 1854. And here Catherine is mending some fishing nets right there on the shore. And whether people lived on or off the reservation, they used traditional life skills to subsist, relying on hunting, trapping, and fishing to make a living. And Jim LaPlante, a Chippewa City descendant, remembers eating a lot of fish caught by his Uncle Bill, who is again in this picture. He said, "My uncle was a commercial fisherman. In the fall of the year especially, he'd go out for herring. And Mother would tell me, take that bucket there down to your Uncle Bill and see if he's got some fish. He'd have a whole boatload full, and I'd that bucket and take it home." This is a picture of a family at Sugarbush, which this particular Sugarbush is located just above Crawfield on Maple Hill. And pictured here in this photo is Kate Frost, the woman in the apron or the skirt standing outside the wigwam, her family. And the young boy in front who has his hand up in front of his face is Jim Whitson. And Jim Whitson is someone I interviewed extensively for Walking the Old Road. Jim was a very generous storyteller. He really believed that the story of Chippewa City was an important one to tell. And so I do my best to honor Jim by including as many of his words as possible, including about going to Sugarbush with his grandmother, Kate. And so I'm going to share a description that Jim shared with me when I interviewed him. The work of harvesting the natural resources on the North Shore has been in place for at least 1,000 years. Like harvesting wild rice in the fall and tapping trees all along the Sawtooth Mountains every spring. And this is Jim Whitson, who went to Sugarbush with his grandmother, Kate Frost, every spring. He said, "My grandmother had a place where she had a birch bark teepee, and her sisters had teepees down the road a ways, maybe 1/4 mile down one side and the other, maybe 1/2 mile the other way. And what happened is they'd make it just like a community while we were up there. They'd visit each other at night. Maybe we'd walk over to my grandmother's sister or maybe her cousins and we'd visit. They'd all get around the bonfire and the teepee, and they'd sit and talk and have a little tea, or maybe a little homemade wine or something. And it was just enjoyable. I was a little boy, and I used to enjoy that, just sitting around that fire. It would feel so good, and to be in the teepee. And then my grandma would go out, and she'd take a hatchet, and I'd go with her, and she'd tap these trees. She'd angle a hatchet against a maple tree a certain way and hit it with a hammer or something and make a notch in there, only so far on this maple tree. And then she made wedges out of wood. I don't know, I think she made them ahead of time and had them in her teepee. And she'd she'd pound these into that maple tree, and that's where the sap would drip. And then she'd make birch bark containers made out of birch bark and set them down below that tap. And there's a very long, beautiful description of what happens next in Walking the Old Road. What you see here is a handmade hooked rug, which measures probably 4 feet by 3 feet. Its maker is Lucy Caribou, Philomene Evans' sister. And while Philomene lived in Mineral Center at the border, Lucy Caribou lived close to where the Free Church is today here in Grand Marais. And the big old spruce trees that are there, I suspect, are Lucy's, the ones she planted. And Lucy is one of the Ojibwe Anishinaabe women who made a living making beautiful things here in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. My Aunt Gloria Martineau told me the story of Lucy Caribou, and she said, Lucy hooked rugs, and her rugs were absolutely gorgeous. Her whole kitchen was filled with boxes of rags that she cut up. She had a great big loom on her table all the time. I mean, people from all over the country had Lucy's rugs. And she braided rugs too. She made a picture on the rugs, and there would be like an oval in the center, and there would be 2 deer or something. And then on the edge, it would be like black. But then she would make all these beautiful flowers all around the edge. And people from all over, once they found Lucy's rugs at Philomene's stand in Mineral Center, then she made a living that way. I asked Aunt Gloria what kind of price Lucy would get for these beautiful, large, hand-hooked or hand-braided rugs. And she thought for a moment and said, $25, $30, something like that. Back then, it was a lot of money, I guess. Michael Morrison also described how he and his siblings would make things to sell as souvenirs to tourists. The Morrison family lived in Chippewa City, which is 1 mile east of the current city limits of Grand Marais. And he said, we made handmade things, woodwork canoes, paddles made of wood. So we got a lot of money from that. And we made tomahawks out of wood and bone with hide and sold them. As the Ojibwe tradition and way of life was gradually overtaken by European ways, Ojibwe culture would become increasingly in demand by the growing numbers of visitors to the area who were excited to experience what was being sold as authentic Indian culture. Henry Mayhew's daughter, Edith Mayhew Strom, describes the arrival of a passenger ship to the Grand Marais harbor. She said, now when these passenger boats would come in, why, you could hear them from Whitson. And when this whistle was heard, the Indians started from Chippewa village and came up in single file. Some of them had papooses on their backs, and some of them had these rolls of mats, and they had their baskets. They all went down on the dock and waited for the passengers to come off, and they'd buy their baskets and moccasins and other beaded objects that they might have for sale. And it's this turning point in history where it should be pointed out that Native culture was making the switch from Anishinaabe majority on the North Shore to European majority on the North Shore. And as the economy changed, the people who were able to make things, who were able to log, who were able to fish, who were able to serve as fishing guides, to harvest maple syrup and other natural resources. The people off reservation ended up having a greater access to the economy than those who lived within the bounds of the Grand Portage Reservation. And so the off-reservation communities, like at Chippewa City and here in Grand Marais, found it somewhat easier to make a living than those who lived within the borders of the Grand Portage Reservation. And so that is one of the changes that took place as we move from the 1920s into the 30s. And also the shift towards tourism started to change the way that the Anishinaabe relationships to the European settlers in terms of the dynamics at play. For example, there's a 1920s ad that was placed in regional newspapers or magazines by the Grand Marais Businessmen's Club, who advertised that, quote, Grand Marais extends a cordial invitation for you to come in the winter, spring, summer, or fall. Every season has its attractions. Every day is a joy day. And they have photos and pictures of various attractions that include Rose Lake, the Stairway Portage, and unfortunately, Indian Maids. By the 1920s, natural resources on the North Shore were becoming depleted. With timber resources growing thin, traditional hunting and trapping grounds became smaller, and having to compete with Scandinavian fishermen for herring and trout, many Anishinaabe people, both on and off the reservation, had to turn to the growing tourist industry to make a living. Some people made homemade crafts to sell at the Johnson Trading Post or in stands at Mineral Center or along Highway 61. And many others worked in the local hotels or restaurants that served tourists. Jim Whitson described how his own grandmother made a living trading her homemade crafts. He said, she did a lot of beadwork and she made baskets, and all that stuff she made, she'd sell it. In those days, there wasn't much money to transact. People would give her groceries for maybe a few baskets. We had a lady coming from Duluth, and she used to come down there and buy a bunch of this stuff for souvenirs and take them to Duluth. And she'd probably sell it to tourists in Duluth or sell them to who knows. But around the community itself, everything was traded in goods. And again, this is another change that happened in the 20s towards the 30s and 40s, is that the people of the off-reservation communities traded with each other for goods, but were a part of the local economy in that they sold things to tourists and to the people who lived in Grand Marais. And so these early makers really did their part to grow this very early tourist economy in various ways. And you know, I'm sure that people will have questions about that as we go, and I'm happy to try to answer them. But that's the way it was. That's how life was. This is Elizabeth Anaquat, who is my great-grandmother, who was born in Chippewa City. And there's a news article here featuring her and some other makers, including Irwin Wiggins, Elizabeth Drouillard, who also later was known as Elizabeth Collins, Mrs. Arthur Miltonberg, and Teresa Newton. And that is from 1938. The center picture is a handmade birch bark container, or a makuk. And you can see there's etching sort of on the inside, and the basketry work around the edges, and the quilled design, floral design. And this tool is her awl. And it's a very, very sharp little point embedded tightly in a hand-carved wooden handle. And that's what she used to make that. Great-grandma, like Lucy Caribou and Philomene Evans and others, supplemented her income by making these and selling them to tourists. And she lived in Chippewa City for a time, and she also lived on the east side of Grand Marais, sort of where the North Shore Federal Credit Union is. And this picture of her was taken in Chippewa City. The Native people who lived in Grand Marais and Grand Portage between 1900 and 1930 experienced this transition between an economy that was reliant on their traditional skills and knowledge of the area to support their families, and then it switched to an economy that was based in cultural appropriation or exploitation. And as part of this switch, which was common throughout the United States, not just here, it was believed that Native culture was something that could be bought in a store. That was the prevailing philosophy behind all of this. And from the 30s through the 50s, handmade goods began to be edged out by mass-marketed versions of trading post curios that depicted Native Americans and Native culture in a cartoonish or exaggerated way. When these inauthentic knickknacks were brought in wholesale, there was less demand for the more authentic handmade souvenirs that many people relied on to make a living. Because of the overt attempts by non-Native people to sell Grand Marais as a, quote, Indian village, many visitors to the area had certain expectations of what it means to be an Indian and how they thought an Indian was supposed to act. I interviewed Grand Portage band member Vivian Waltz, who shared this personal encounter that she had with visitors to Grand Marais in the late 1930s. She said, "Well, I think most of the tourists that came up that way thought that the Indians lived in teepees and mud houses. I used to work at Mabel's Cafe, and one morning there was about 3 or 4 ladies that came in there. They'd gone up to Chippewa City and Grand Portage, and on their way back, they said to me, 'In Grand Portage and Chippewa City too, we were surprised that there were houses.' Then another woman said to me, 'Do you see very many Indians?' Vivian paused, gave me a sly smile, and continued. I said to her, 'Every morning when I look in the mirror,' and we both burst out laughing right there at her kitchen table. She tapped my arm in a playful way and said, 'I think I could have bought her for 2 cents. And this photo comes from the Cook County Historical Society via Dan Helmerson, who shared this with me. This is in Walking the Old Road in Chapter 7, at the point where I begin to talk about this shift in the economy and the effects that it did have on the Anishinaabe people who lived here at that time. So, not only are there traditional makers and craftspeople who paved the way for our current creative economy, but also the work of visionary artists like George Morrison, who was born and raised in Chippewa City, just 1 mile east of Grand Marais. And he is arguably one of the most famous modern artists from Minnesota, and quite potentially the world. And I had the great fortune to know George, and he was one of the first people I interviewed for Walking the Old Road. He agreed to meet with my sister and I, and we visited him at his house at Red Rock Bay, and he shared all sorts of wonderful stories about his family growing up in Chippewa City, and the Drouillards, who were neighbors, and the Anaquats, who were the original landowners at Chippewa City. And so I think when we're thinking through the current state of embracing a culture of creativity and art, and the way that I believe the arts economy plays such a huge role in the success of our local community. And what draws visitors here and continues to draw visitors here is this tradition that we need to honor people like George and Philomene and Lucy and great grandma Elizabeth Anaquat and Mrs. Miltonberg, and the modern makers like Bob Swanson and Marcy McIntyre, and people who are painting and doing beadwork and quill work still, because they learned it from their parents, who learned it from their parents, who learned it from their parents. And the state of Anishinaabe creative culture is strong. If you'd like to know where you can find some original works of art, I'm happy to answer that in a question later. But I do want to share these words that George shared with me. He was so generous with his time. And I asked him at one point if his own grandmother was proud of the old ways. And he said, "Sure she was. There's a certain pride in every nationality. Each has specialties and uniqueness in their own way. But I felt I wanted to deliberately go away from that and go to art school in Minneapolis to a completely different world. There are a lot of Indians in the Twin Cities. There has been a tremendous influx from surrounding reservations, becoming white men in a sense by adapting everything, thinking, education, white art. But underneath, one can never leave that. There is something inside that always comes through. Gradually, the landscape themes crept through into my art. The indirect influences of land, water, and wood. I have never tried to prove that I was an Indian by doing baskets or painting feathers." And this piece here is called Rocks, Crags, Dark Water, and Sky. And thanks to Breon Morrison for sharing that work of art for Walking the Old Road. And so now we've arrived back at Grand Marais. This is Angus Lesage. I believe that's a typo. It's Angus Lesage, Julie Caribou with her friend Anna Mush, and Paul Cadence. This is an old postcard for the Grand Marais area, and you can see these beautiful straight etched birch bark macaques that Ms. Caribou is undoubtedly going to bring to market. And with that, we've got 15 minutes left for questions. And the thing that I always like to end with, in the spirit of Bimadzi Adazukan, is everyone remember that it's up to us to create a new story, and new stories are created every day and shared. And now it's up to us to listen and to honor them and to remember me, you.
Thank you so much, Staci. That was really fascinating. And I am sure that there are some questions out there. We've already had a couple come in. A question about the first image that you had of Philomene's gift shop, noting that there were some totem poles and wondering if the Anishinaabe made totem poles.
That's a good question. Totem poles are Northwest Coast traditionally. And I think the ones you see here are not a traditional Anishinaabe thing. On the Northwest Coast, they're used to tell stories, and there are very gigantic ones outside potlatch buildings, and they all have meaning. And I'm going to say that these were done artistically, but not traditionally.
Great. Yeah, it seems like it's probably part of advertising yourself as a gift shop that has Indian made goods, what people are looking for.
It's kind of what was expected, I think.
Right. Fascinating. Patricia Cainlake asks if any Lucy caribou rugs are still in existence to look at. Are they in museums? And notes that they're just remarkable, which they absolutely are.
I believe that there are some Lucy caribou rugs at the Grand Portage State Park.
All right. Yep. Oh, and the same question from Rachel. It's northern Minnesota in general, many rug making traditions I know came, and there's whole exhibits on the range in particular. And so I would have to imagine that some of those beautiful rugs are available for people to see in lots of places, hopefully. Yeah. Question from Sue Hakes. I noticed that the children in your photos were often being cared for or standing next to men. How was parenting shared between men and women?
That's a good question, Sue, and I'm not a parent. So traditionally, the Anishinaabe society is more shared in terms of duties. It's not strictly matriarchal or patriarchal. And, but I don't really, I mean, I think it just depends on the family.
Great. Let's see. When did the community of Chippewa City disappear? Dory Carlson is wondering.
Okay. Chippewa City has not completely disappeared because the St. Francis Xavier Church is still there, as well as some other signs, including a cemetery that's still used north of the church. The people moved away in the late 1930s, and there were a number of factors that went into that, including the World Wars and the Depression, and also this change in the economy. I think it got more and more difficult for Anishinaabe people to make a living as mass-produced goods took the place of wooden tomahawks. They were replaced with plastic tomahawks, and unfortunately, you'll still find these plastic tomahawks somewhere in some places. And so all of those factors contributed to the fall of Chippewa City. Also entering in is the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which provided opportunities within the boundaries of the reservations. It gave people jobs that weren't there before. It also provided some other things, or an incentive for off-reservation communities to move onto reservations. So that was a big factor too. And not all of the Chippewa City people or Grand Marais Anishinaabe went to Grand Portage. Some moved to Duluth, some moved to the Range, some Minneapolis. It was a time of historical migration. which is the case with a lot of Anishinaabe history.
A question about noting that a lot of the pieces that you showed had flower motifs. Are there particular flower motifs that are important?
The Ojibwe floral patterns are an amazing cultural phenomenon. And these patterns are, I mean, you see a lot of similar flowers, types of flowers that are native flowers or familiar flowers. The designs are done in everything from tiny little beads to really ornate embroidery or fabric quilting on skirts or vests or other clothing. I mean, they are a signature design element for Anishinaabe people. And they're as varied as there are artists. How's that? Absolutely.
I feel like when you walk through the woods up here in June, you can see where the inspiration comes from. Joan Farnham is curious about where you can find Anishinaabe artwork by local artisans.
Good question. There's a shop in Grand Portage that Marcy McIntyre, who is a bead artist, runs. And there's a collective gallery in Duluth called AICHO, A-I-C-H-O, which has an amazing variety of works by regional Anishinaabe people. And that they have a great website. I would start there.
A-I-C-O, you said?
A-I-C-H-O.
C-H-O.
In Duluth. And there's a storefront, although I'm not sure the storefront is open because of the coronavirus safety issues. But they have a great website of handmade goods and other indigenous goods.
Wonderful. And then one more question from Rhonda. The Cadence River is named after Cadence. Is that an Anishinaabe word or have meaning?
Cadence is an Anishinaabe word, and you'll notice that the sign is different from the actual name spelling. Let's see here. I think the sign, yes, this is the proper way to spell Cadence. And I believe it's with an A on the street marker. And so the Cadence River is where the Cadence family lived. So it's named that beautiful area there on the beach where the river goes into Lake Superior is where that family lived.
Another question from Sue. I appreciate you raising awareness about cultural appropriation, exploitation, and thinking about how we are still doing that today. Can you talk a little more about this?
Sure. I'll use the example of cultural appropriation to doing traditional crafts. So traditional crafts, so the word for bead in Ojibwe is little spirit. So the beads are seen as having spirit, being alive, being animate. The creation that is made with the beads is equally animate, alive, and has a spirit. When you think about artwork as having, being driven by a sense of spirit, I think it might explain why it's not okay to read a book about making a traditional hand drum and then going out and cutting down a cedar tree and making a drum without having those cultural belief systems to make sure that it's done in the right way. And so, you know, there are a lot of varying opinions about that. I'm just speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for anyone else, just for myself. But when it comes to traditional crafts like beadwork, it's essential that you have an Anishinaabe teacher, and that you learn how to honor the materials, how to honor the history of the piece, how to honor the design work. And I think that will change the way that we think about these objects that are made. So cultural appropriation in terms of learning and honoring is really important.
Great, thank you for that. Question about possessions Anishinaabe considered highly necessary. For example, I cannot leave the house without my pocket knife.
Oh, I don't know. A lot of people don't leave the house without their phones anymore. So I don't know. I mean, that
Probably depends on what you're leaving the house to do.
right. Things change. The story changes. The objects in your pockets change. And so all of it is, I think, food for thought in the way that we think about the places that we live and the people who came before, and you know, what did they have in their pockets? I don't know. I think that's a great question. I wish I knew.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll wrap up. I do want to note Sarah has posted some links in the chat to both Marcy's gallery and the gallery in Duluth you mentioned, as well as a link to places where folks can purchase your book, including Drury Lane Books. Yeah, and I think that will wrap it up. I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and thank you so much, Staci. The Wooden Boat Show continues, the online here, and I would be remiss if I failed to note that the only reason we're able to do things like this is through the support of our members, just like places like NPR and WTIP. North House relies on support from our members, and so thank you to all of you who have supported us in that way. If it's something that you're interested in doing, we do have a match going, and your gift to North House in June will be matched dollar for dollar. We have been closed since March, which complicates the process of balancing the books. So the support is very much appreciated during these strange times so that we can continue to tell stories and invite people to share what they know, which is really at the root of what North House is about. So thanks to everybody for coming. That link to make a gift is in the chat window. And most of all, thank you so much, Staci, for sharing these stories with us.
Thanks, Jessa.
Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.